They are a new SQL partner, and we are enormously excited to have them join us today and share their expertise with us. If you are new to SQL or you're not a SQL member, we highly encourage you to reach out to us, to check out our website, which I'll post in the chat, and let us know how we can help you. We understand 2020 and the moment we're in now, it's extremely challenging. And we as an organization are here to support you as a childcare leader to get through this moment, to survive and hopefully thrive. And one of those topics that we've had many discussions with SQL members in the greater California childcare audience is vaccinations. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce John and China. John and China, go ahead and take it away.
Very good, Dave. Thank you so much. To the group, welcome. And reinforcing something Dave just said, this is a difficult time and hopefully we'll provide some clarity on this one issue. Let me just give you a sentence or two about what China and I do. We are at a law firm in San Francisco, Hirschfeld Kramer, that just does employment law on behalf of employers. So we represent employers for things like litigation, advice and counsel, training, and internal investigations. And since certainly March, we've been kind of riding the same roller coaster all of you have in terms of things that have occurred around COVID, government regulations, government statutes, county health orders, all of that impact all of you as employers, and understand not only is it difficult to proceed day by day, especially in your area, but it's a changing landscape. And that's one point I wanted to make, which is the best advice we're giving you right now is as of January 28th, 2021. And things do change over time. So what we talk about is in terms of the vaccine, in 2 months, there may be government regulations that supersede what we're talking about. So you need to kind of keep apprised about what's going on. With that being said, let me tell you what the 4 things we hope to accomplish in the time we have for you. And if there are questions, because the group is large, if you put them in chat, Dave's gonna kind of run interference for us, and toward the end of the training, will be asking us questions around that. So that's the preferred methodology. So the 4 objectives, number 1, and the essential question is, can you legally require your employees to be vaccinated for COVID? Number 2, if you do that, are there legal risks and what are they? Number 3, is the preferred pathway to make it voluntary and to encourage folks to go ahead and get the vaccine? And number 4, aligned with that, is what assistance can you provide? So those are our objectives. We'll be flipping back and forth between myself and China, but let me start off around the essential question, which is, can you legally require your employees to get vaccinated for COVID? So as an initial point, understand that unlike other vaccines that can be mandated for you as childcare providers, the state of California has not come forward and said, okay, we are going to require a COVID vaccine for all of your employees. So that's kind of the foundational point, that we don't have that to rely upon. The next kind of significant point of information that we have is from the EEOC. The EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That is the federal agency that controls the employment relationship, that sets forth standards, regulation, guidance on discrimination, harassment, interpretation of a variety of laws. In mid-December, they came out and said that employers may require the COVID vaccine. Now, let me give you a little depth around that, kind of that statement from the EEOC, and understand, don't don't leave this webinar right now, because that's not ultimately where we're going to land. But I want you to kind of see the progression and why we advise our clients the way we do. So the EEOC came and it surprised some people to say, okay, you can require it. And a couple of things they talked about it. One is that they wrote and stated that the vaccine itself is not to be considered a medical exam. And as many as you know, an employer cannot require someone to undertake a medical exam, for example, pre-employment, unless what is being evaluated is directly related to what is required in the business. So in most employers now in 2021 are not requiring physical exams from a doctor. Some do, but most do not. So they said, first of all, it's not a medical exam. Number two, requiring proof of that you have gotten vaccinated against COVID also is not what they would call a disability-related inquiry, meaning you are not doing something that is reasonably calculated for that employee to say to you or divulge to you that they have a disability. And if you've been in your line of work for a long period of time, it used to be on employment applications, people would ask, do you have a disability that would impact your ability to do the job? That was regularly printed. But disability law came in at the federal and state level and said that's an improper inquiry. You can't do that. So they said this is not that, because it's not likely to get information about somebody's disability to just say, okay, we're going to require that. The EEOC also said, and I'm going to loop back in a few moments on this issue, that even though you may be able to require it, you have to consider a reasonable accommodation in two areas. One is religious observance or beliefs. Number two is disability or medical issues. And I'm going to loop back on that a little bit because it aligns both with if you were to require it, but also if you make it voluntary after China addresses a couple of issues. So what we're left with around December 16th is, okay, well, it looks good. It looks like you could require the COVID vaccine on your folks. But upon further analysis, and where we're landing is there are problems associated with that. I'm going to talk about one, then China is going to talk about another. So the first major concern is related to the vaccines and how they're characterized by the Food and Drug Administration. Both Pfizer and Moderna, the two vaccines that are being rolled out in our state and across the country, have received from the FDA what is called emergency use authorization. Now, we're thankful of that because it's allowed it to be rolled out before what would be a full approval by the FDA, because as we all know, the kind of testing process around the vaccine was greatly compressed because of the public need. But because this vaccine has received what is known as emergency use authorization, it causes the following concern, because as part of that process, anybody who receives the vaccine, in essence, a patient, I'll use that word, there should be a disclosure, there should be a fact sheet provided to the person which says that per the FDA guidelines, the patient knows that they have the right to either accept or refuse the vaccine itself. So that's part of our premise. So here's the dilemma. Let's say you require it, somebody goes to Walgreens or goes to their physician or medical group and get it, and they've been given the proper disclosures. They read it and they say, you know what, I don't want to do that. I don't feel comfortable. And they come to you and say, dear employer, I don't want to do it. I'm not sure this is safe. I'm not sure it's okay. And anyway, the FDA says I can refuse it. So then you're put on the horns of the dilemma. If you're requiring it, what do you do with folks who say, no, I'm not going to do it? And Most times, if you as an employer say you are required to do something, there is a consequence if you don't. The issue is, what if you terminate the person? What if you say, okay, if you aren't going to get the vaccine, you can't work here any longer, or you can't start work here? So then the person is fired, is out there, and the bottom line they're saying is, I got fired for simply following the law. All I did was follow the FDA guidance that I am allowed under FDA guidance to refuse the vaccine. In California, what that's styled as is a wrongful termination against public policy. And that creates risk for you. So this is the first of two reasons where we are advising our clients not to mandate it, but to make it voluntary. And China will be talking about that in a bit. But this is only the first legal reason that creates some risk. I want to turn it over to China to talk about the second legal reason.
Thanks. So the second concern we have in a situation where you as the employer decides to mandate that employees get the vaccine is, again, where the employee says, I don't want to get it, I don't feel safe, I heard the FDA hasn't even fully approved it, I don't feel comfortable. So if that's the case, perhaps the employee is written up. They don't have to be terminated, perhaps they're written up. They might then have a claim under OSHA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and Section 11C of OSHA protects employees who express safety concerns about the workplace from facing retaliation. Retaliation under OSHA occurs when an employer takes some kind of adverse action against an employee who engages in a protected activity. And let me break down what that means. So the adverse action is some type of action by the employer that might dissuade a reasonable employee from raising a concern about the workplace. So here, if an employee comes to the employer and says, you've required me to get the vaccine, I don't feel comfortable, I'm not going to get it, and that employee is written up, then it's possible that other employees in the workplace are going to be afraid to raise the same concerns because they saw that their coworker was disciplined for doing so. So that would be considered an adverse action under OSHA. The protected activity here is raising the concern about the vaccine being safe. That's what's protected under OSHA. So we can move to the next slide here. And just a note about these claims, as John mentioned, the landscape is changing really quickly, as we've all seen over the last year. So we don't know yet how courts might handle them. These are just the two most likely potential claims we believe you could see from employees if you mandate the vaccine and then take steps against employees who refuse to get it. So right now, our recommendation is not to mandate the vaccine, but to make it voluntary to your employees. So employees under a voluntary model either need to get the vaccine, or we recommend for employees who don't want to get the vaccine that you require them to sign some kind of acknowledgement form that would simply document for your business who has not received it. And for employees who are receiving the vaccine, it's appropriate if you would like to ask for some kind of verification from the medical provider just to show that the vaccine was administered to that person. If you run into a situation where an employee refuses to get the vaccine, which is acceptable under a voluntary policy, but then also refuses to sign an acknowledgement form stating that they chose not to get it, it might be appropriate to discipline that person. This is going to be really fact specific. So if you run into a problem like this, we recommend that you sit down, have a conversation with the employee, ask them what are their concerns, why are they not comfortable signing the form, and loop in your legal counsel if you think that disciplinary steps might be appropriate. You might already be getting questions from concerned parents wanting to know, what are you doing to protect my children? Is the provider who is interacting with my child every day vaccinated, or has he or she told you they want to receive the vaccine? These are understandable concerns and questions, but they can be tricky to answer. First of all, and most importantly, we recommend that you do not disclose any specific information about whether your employees are or are not vaccinated. That's private medical information, and you do not want to be disclosing that to parents. Instead, we recommend that you are honest with parents to the extent that you tell them, we're not mandating the vaccine right now. We are making it voluntary, but we're encouraging employees to get it. We're taking other steps to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce the risk of COVID transmission in the workplace. You could tell them about the steps that you're taking. And if you're taking any additional measures to facilitate employees getting the vaccine, which I'll talk about a little bit later, you can tell parents about that too, and that might help ease some of their discomfort. I think we can move to the next slide. So as John kind of alluded to, this is the advice we're giving today, January 28th. That's not to say that in the future, if the COVID vaccines receive full FDA approval, that our, at that point, our advice might change, and it certainly could be appropriate down the line to mandate the vaccine, but we're just not in a position to say that, and we don't feel that's appropriate as of today. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to John.
Thanks, China. So one of the things I wanted to talk about that I alluded to earlier is the reasonable accommodation obligation. So this isn't tied to whether it's mandated or voluntary. If somebody comes forward to you, it certainly would be implicated if it's mandatory and then somebody comes forward. But there are two kind of buckets of situations that you have to be concerned about: religious accommodation or accommodation for disability or medical issue. And someone may say, I understand that it's important to get the vaccine. I get that. And I understand that pretty much everybody at our place is getting it. And I'm kind of an outlier on that because everyone's talking about it. But I have to tell you that because of my religious beliefs, I don't feel comfortable getting any vaccine, or this vaccine in particular. And let me explain for a moment pitfalls that employers feel sometimes fall under here. So number one, do you have an obligation to reasonably accommodate someone's religious beliefs, practices? The answer is yes, you do. It's a reasonable accommodation issue. You may say, it's unreasonable. I think it's unreasonable that somebody says because of their religious beliefs, they're not going to get a vaccine. That's not the basis to challenge it. You may also say, I don't even think they really believe what they're saying. They've never talked about this religion before, this religious belief before. And I'll just tell you from experience, your assumption should be that when the person is expressing that good faith belief, it's a good faith belief. Assume that. Don't do, as thankfully not one of the clients of China and mine, but in one of the reported cases where an employer actually said, well, I don't know about this whole thing you're talking about. It wasn't specifically about COVID vaccines, but you need to bring a letter from your pastor to say this is actually a belief of this religion. And the person refused, got fired, and the employer in that situation was on the wrong end of a very messy lawsuit. So don't kind of challenge and say, gee, I don't think this is a real belief or something. And in fact, one of the concerns I have is not just anti-vaxxers that might be out there to say, gee, I don't think any vaccines are good, but people now knowing about this, characterizing a belief as a religious belief when it's, again, a newfound belief. So I think that's a very difficult road to hoe. I think a better practice for you is to say, okay, if that's your belief, then let's figure out whether we can reasonably accommodate. And I want to hold that for a minute until we get to the disability part. So that's kind of religion. Assume it's a good faith belief, turn to reasonable accommodation as a possibility. Same process for disability or medical issue, but one of the interesting things that occurs in this reasonable accommodation is, boy, could we overcome it somehow? And for those of you who are sophisticated in this area, you might say, well, what if, and I've been doing some reading on this, what if I say, you know what, this is a direct threat. And gee, if someone poses a direct threat to my organization, whether it's to the coworkers of this employee or to our children, then can't I say I don't have to reasonably accommodate? And that's a very sophisticated response. So let's break that down for just a moment for a second, where you might not have to reasonably accommodate. What is a direct threat? It is a situation where there is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health and safety either of the employee or to others in the workplace. And this is the important caveat, it can't be eliminated by a reasonable accommodation. So what's kind of looked at? Well, the threat is looked at in terms of what's the duration of the risk, what's the nature and severity of the harm, what's the likelihood of the harm, and how imminent is the harm. So we could say, well, gee, if our staff members get COVID, that's very significant. It's very real. Transmission is very real. And I can articulate a direct threat. And I think on the face of it, there's a reason to argue that. And again, where we are is if you say, I can't reasonably accommodate you. But the pushback is, what have you been doing for the past 6 or 9 months? How have you been running your program? Have you been reasonably accommodating folks by making sure that there are safe practices consistent with CDC, state of California, local county health authority guidance on that? And the answer is before. We've been waiting for the COVID vaccine. But for those of you that have been operational and taking care of kids, you're doing it by employing all those safety practices to make sure both your staff are safe and the children are safe. So the argument that it's a direct threat and we don't need to accommodate, unfortunately, is a bit undercut by the reasonable accommodation aspect of what you've been doing for months. So as a consequence, take-home lesson, kind of bottom line around this is, if somebody says, let's say you're pursuing the path we recommend, and it's a voluntary situation, but somebody says, look, I have to tell you that I'm not going to get a vaccine. Here's why I'm going to get it. And it's because I have concerns about my own medical condition around that, so I'm not going to do it. But I want to continue to work. I want to continue to work with the kids. How can we do that? It would be incumbent upon you to look at a reasonable accommodation that would be consistent with what you've been doing for months on that. So now let's assume for a moment that you're pursuing a voluntary program, as China talked about. What kind of assistance can the employer provide to the employees to help or encourage them?
Sure. So it's absolutely okay to encourage employees and to facilitate even those employees getting the COVID-19 vaccine. The CDC has actually published what they call vaccine toolkits for employers, which later in the presentation we'll have a link to the part of the website that has this. And the toolkit that would apply to your industry would be the Essential Workers Toolkit. And in there are some FAQs to employers, which I'd encourage you to read through. And I'm going to go through one that is particularly helpful, I think, here. The question is, how can I encourage my employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine? And what the CDC recommends is several different approaches. First, this might not be possible for all employers, but if possible, you could host a vaccine clinic at your workplace. And that would actually involve offering the vaccine at no charge to employees on site. And to the extent that this was something you're able to consider, the CDC recommends contacting your local health department for some advice on how to administer that. This is not going to be possible for most employers. So the CDC also recommends if you can't do this, then look at your human resources policies. Can you be flexible? Can you give employees time off work to go get vaccinated? Can you support transportation methods to get them to be vaccinated? For example, maybe you help them pay for an Uber or a Lyft to get there, On a larger scale, for larger childcare providers, maybe you're able to afford to provide busing for employees to go get vaccinated. So those are options too. Separately, the CDC also recommends posting promotional posters or flyers around your facility. You can look to high traffic areas like your break room, cafeteria, anywhere else like that where employees would see postings, and you can actually put up information about some of the benefits of receiving the vaccine, the risks of COVID, things like that. You might also, to the extent you are emailing your employees, circulating a newsletter, if you have an intranet, you can also post materials that support the benefits of the vaccine in those locations too. Next slide here, talking just a little bit more about these resources that are available from the CDC. There's actually a template letter they've put together, and this is intended to be used by employers actually to send around to employees, encouraging them to get vaccinated. And it talks about some of the benefits of the vaccine, some of the risks of COVID, and therefore presenting kind of a position in favor of vaccination while not requiring it and still keeping it voluntary. So that's certainly something you can look to send to your employees. And we'll be able to circulate this link after our presentation's finished, I'm sure.
Dave, that's something you can do for the group, correct?
Yes, we actually just posted it in the chat, and we'll plug it into the event software as well after the event.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
So I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Okay, well, that in terms of the presentation, that's where we are. But Dave, do you have some questions from the group that you think would be beneficial?
I certainly do.
Okay.
Yes.
So do I see that number correctly, that you actually you might have 40 questions?
45, in fact, actually.
Okay.
45.
We won't be able to do all 45, so we're relying upon you to do appropriate triage here.
Sure. So the first one is, can an employer tie bonus payment to the completion and proof of vaccine?
So let me start off in China, just chime in, please, whatever you think. So there are many employers that are considering the payment of something nominal to encourage people to do it. Number one, the question seems to imply that maybe that there is a bonus that's been earned or talked about, and the answer would be no. You wouldn't want to condition something that's been earned or promised to somebody on getting the COVID vaccine. We're discouraging our clients from offering a monetary bonus or incentive to do it, and it certainly shouldn't be too much, because then the question is, what happens to the folks who cannot do it due to a religious or disability-related accommodation issue, or decline to do so for those reasons? I think it creates the wrong kind of financial incentive around that. So could you do it? Potentially, yes, you could do it. It's not necessarily unlawful to do it. It needs to be of some nominal nature. It shouldn't be a lot of money. And I obviously know in childcare, most of the employers don't have substantial financial resources to do it. But my personal advice to clients is not to do that. I think it creates the wrong dynamic. China, just out of interest, have you had clients that are interested in doing that talk to you yet?
Not yet, as far as offering incentives.
Okay.
And to follow up to that, what would you consider nominal or ballpark if you could?
If it was $100 or less.
Got it.
The question for those groups are, if I say I have a religious observance or a medical issue that precludes me from getting it, the question for the employers, are those people going to be eligible for that bonus as well? And there's an argument that you don't need to, but then it does, part of the consequence and why I don't think it's a great idea is it creates employee relations issues. Gee, I didn't get it because of my religion, and now the employer's holding that against me.
Got it. And just to be clear, for the accommodations to go get the vaccine, can you pay them for the time of transportation, waiting in line, in getting the vaccine in the clinic? Can that be paid time?
Yes, it can be. And in fact, if you're requiring it, a best practice, if it's something you're requiring, it's a best practice would be that you're paying for that time, because that's a requirement and it's time worked. So that's why some employers we know have, one of my clients did arrange a bus, did arrange it, and they were essential workers. And so they got that facilitated through their kind of local health provider. And that was kind of a good way, and it was all work time, paid work time.
Got it. Okay. We're getting some questions about workers' comp. If you were to make it mandatory, how does that interact with workers' comp? And I assume that question is about liability or interaction with the vaccine.
So if the question is somebody gets the vaccine, the shot, and then has an adverse reaction to it, and it was required, the short answer is I don't know for certain, because it depends for a bit if it's required and it's done on work time and the employer's facilitated. I think a claim for workers' comp would be more well placed than if simply says we require it and people are doing it and going to Walgreens or the healthcare provider on their own time. I don't know how workers' comp, your carrier, would deal with that. China, any ideas on that one?
No, I agree with you though, that it could fall under workers' comp potentially.
Okay. Someone brought up the fact that we as childcare providers require our staff members to wear masks when at work. Is it reasonable to require those who do not receive the vaccine in the future to continue to wear masks, even if the state no longer requires masks for those in the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. And I would think you would want to do that. That's the reasonable accommodation aspect. If somebody is opting out, it's voluntary and they're not getting the vaccine, but you want to reduce the likelihood of the potential spread of the virus, to do all the things you're doing now in terms of washing hands, wearing masks. You know, in the past week now, they're coming out and saying 2 masks are better than 1. So things will continue to change on that, but absolutely, yes.
Okay. Is there any risk in promoting the vaccine too heavily? And if an employee was to have an adverse reaction, being held accountable for that or liable for that? I think this is related to that workers' comp one a bit.
Yeah, China, you want to take that?
Sure. As far as promoting it too heavily, I mean, I think it is a balance. You don't want to be promoting it so extremely that every time an employee walks into work who's undecided, you say, hey, are you getting the vaccine? Have you decided? And you're kind of making it uncomfortable for them. That could be seen as placing too much pressure on an employee, where you're saying it's voluntary, but then every day you're asking them about it. So, I mean, I think that's a very extreme example. I would say if you're just sending a letter around to your employees, maybe at a group meeting, you're discussing it, if you're taking reasonable measures to promote it, I don't think there's a risk in doing that. And
if someone gets sick from the vaccine itself, from getting the vaccine, and it's been a voluntary program, the avenue could potentially be workers' comp, as we talked about, depending upon the facts that led to the vaccine being given. Who's paid for it, who's facilitated it, is it on work time, et cetera. There might be a workers' comp claim. But if people are worried about other liability, gee, you employer said it's safe and now I got really sick, so I want to sue you, not under workers' comp, on some other basis. That's actually what the workers' comp system would be in play for if they're tying it to workplace. So if someone's making that claim, you would submit to your workers' comp carrier and you would let them sort it out. That's what your insurance is for.
Thanks. I think Kim Wong, I think that mostly covered yours. It was about extra pay if staff have reactions and who would cover that. I think that's somewhat captured there. I'm happy to speak with you directly if it's not fully covered. Alan asked, can we waive the travel guidelines for those who are vaccinated based on the local travel restrictions guidelines?
So, well, the travel guidelines seems to be changing on a weekly basis almost.
Does.
So if what I understand is if somebody gets vaccinated and there is a travel guideline, like within California, more than 120 miles, there should be a quarantining or that aspect of it. We would have to really get down into what those travel advisories say. I do not believe they even discuss vaccination as a way to absolve somebody of responsibility of following the travel advisories. But I think that is such a rapidly changing landscape in a week that is probably going to be different than it is today.
It is, and
Yeah, it certainly seems like this is going to be rapidly changing as the vaccine is more widely distributed.
Right.
I will just say briefly about the San Francisco travel or quarantine travel advisory. I looked at it maybe a week ago, so I can't say that it hasn't changed since then, but when I did last review it, it stated that there was an exception for, I believe it's critical infrastructure workers, where if without the person, while they were quarantined, the employer wouldn't have enough staff to offer those services, then there could potentially be an exception. So again, you'd want to look, like John said, at the specific advisory, but it's possible there are some carve-outs.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. Lisa's addressing in the comments that we don't have any guidance on that yet, but it sounds like there will be, or we should expect some soon. As a follow-up for the interactions with the vaccine, say if they had just a light interaction with vaccine, sore arm, sore throat, chills, if you're making it voluntary, should you pay for that time off for a couple days? Is there a requirement there, an expectation?
Well, I think you would follow the particular employer's sick leave policy around that they typically are granted under the California paid sick leave, a certain amount of paid sick leave that is either front loaded or accrued. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend extending that additional paid sick leave around that as a consequence of a reaction to the vaccine. Again, if it becomes longstanding, that's a workers' comp claim, potentially.
Got it. And then I got a couple questions. I'll try to group them together for this one. What is the requirements for an employee who chooses not to vaccinate, but then partakes in, I would say maybe we'll call them risky behaviors outside of work, traveling, going to large events, exposing themselves to the risk of COVID. Are you then going to pay them for COVID sick time when they get sick, even though they didn't contract it in your program? How does that work? So
whether or not they agreed or didn't agree to get the vaccine is irrelevant for that analysis.
Okay.
If someone is engaging in risky behavior or does something so that they have had a close exposure to someone with a positive test, then you have to follow the rules around that. If someone gets a positive test or gets sick, you follow the rules around that. So you remove the aspect of whether they've had the vaccine, whether they refused to take the vaccine because it was made voluntary.
Great. Yasmin is also posting that Senate Bill 1159 covers this specific topic. Thank you, Yasmin. We're not entirely familiar with that, but we'll check it out. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much, John and China, for volunteering your time We are eternally grateful for you joining us and sharing all your expertise with us. I wanted to just point everyone out on the screen is the contact information for John and China and for their firm. Highly encourage you to contact them about their services. I know there are an enormous amount of questions that will come out of this, and I think there's lots of information that will be changing over the coming months. I'll put you on the spot, John and China. I'd love to schedule another one of these in a couple months if you're interested, as things change and see where we're at. Maybe an update to this one.
Absolutely. We'd love to.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you all for joining. We will be updating the slides as well as uploading the recording of this into Early Ed on Demand. And we'll send out the link once that recording is uploaded so you can watch it, get your professional learning certificate, everything like that. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.